special. Hi. Um, so I want to start by saying, well, I should start by saying hi. It's good to be back. Good to see you, and people who are listening who couldn't make it. We did hear from people who are not here that they were sad that they couldn't be here, and we're sad that they couldn't be here too. But given that we were coming into town, I really just offered to Ron Strasma when I was talking to him. I said, if you guys want to talk about what's happening in the RCA, you might be interested, and I'm plugged into that more than a whole lot of other people. So if you want to talk about that, we could. I did not expect it to be some full-fledged, recorded, live stream it on YouTube, the whole thing. So I didn't necessarily think it was going to be anything formal, but I did go, oh, what an idiot. Can somebody get a towel or a paper cloth? It was iced tea. Okay, well, welcome back. You're welcome. Always causing some sort of foolishness. Yes, there's spots on some. I just thought I'd add to the mix. And maybe when Kathy's dog is up here in the future, what's that smell? So anyway, all that to say that yes, I just thought I would gather with a few leaders, but I thought that people who are on leadership, like John, you're a new elder, right, or something like that, right? That might not have the whole context of the RCA, that it might be helpful for you. Maybe it's not. I have no idea. But I also want to say that this is just from my perspective of view of what's happening in the RCA. It's not, the full picture at all. So take it with a grain of whatever you need to take it with a grain of. Yes. So first of all, I'm not sure how many people who have only been around this congregation. Thank you, ladies. What a foolish thing to do. Yeah, and there's a cup holder. So why would you use that when you could just put it on top and hit it over? So if you're not aware of it, we're part of the Reformed Church in America. Both your church and the church that we're at now, Faith Reformed Church in Traverse City, Michigan, is still a part of the Reformed Church in America. But there's a lot happening in the Reformed Church in America, and it has been happening for quite a while. So this is like a little slide that just gives you an update of that. I put 1978 up there because in 1978 there was a report accepted by the General Synod on human sexuality. It was mostly about homosexuality at that time, not about LGBTQ, but about human sexuality, and it was accepted by the General Synod. Now, the way that our denomination works, it just because things accepted at the national body, the national gathering, doesn't mean it's filtered down, because we are not a top-down organization. We are a series of larger assemblies. So there's the elders at your local church. The elders at your local church are all combined into, thank you, ladies, the elders who make up the classis. So the classis is this fleet of ships that run around together. So you're in the Iliana classis here, and that generally consists of just a greater gathering of elders. And then there's a thing called the Regional Synod, which is just a greater gathering of elders, with the thing called the General Synod, which is just a bigger gathering of all those same elders. So it's not like top-down, it's just wider and wider assemblies. So anyway, that happened in 1978, and since then, there's been all sorts of different things that have come up that have brought into question whether or not that should still be the sort of stated policy of the RCA, but it's always been affirmed. Okay? But it's more complicated than that, so you might think that this denomination and many other denominations are just splitting regarding a view of sexuality, whether it's progressive or traditional, but it's much bigger than that. All during that time since 1978, there's also been a lot of questions about what should our missional focus be? What should the church be about? And I don't know how to give a great example of this, so here's just a silly little example. It's not silly at all, but it's a little example. A number of churches might come to the denominational gathering and see that and be disgruntled that big oil is making a lot of money, and that we should divest all of our stock holdings from big oil because they're destroying the earth and destroying humanity in the process. Okay? And so spend time at our General Synod gathering debating whether or not we should divest of all of those stocks and all of that sort of thing. And although that could be a very worthy cause, there were a number of other people who would come to the national gathering and say, this is what we're doing at our national gathering. We should be talking about how we should be making disciples and planting churches and doing this sort of thing. Can you imagine how that could be? And at a number of those sort of national gatherings, every time you get together, what are the key things that we need to talk about? And they're feeling like there was more and more of a divide about those things that we should be talking about. And so it wasn't just about some sort of controversy that would go on about human sexuality. It was about where should our missional focus be? What are the few things? We can't cover everything. We can't be about everything. What are the things that we should have our missional focus on? And then in addition to that, there was a lot of disgruntled people, a lot of people who became disgruntled as it became more and more revealed about the way that our structure works. So within the RCA, like I said, we've got these bigger and bigger assemblies. Who's calling? And so we had just a couple of years ago, we had 46 classes. So in every classes, right, there's 46 classes. And based on the size of the classes, that's how many people could show up to the General Synod gathering. So if you had a big classes full of big churches and lots of people, you could send at the most 4 elders and 4 pastors to the national gathering. And if you were a tiny little one, you could send at the least 2 pastors and 2 elders to the national gathering. Does that make sense? So based on your size, you might get 2 or 3 or 4 of each variety of elder and minister to go to the national gathering. But one of the things that's also true is that you could have a classis that only had like 500 total members in it between all the churches that were in that classis. And then you could have a classis that had 9,000. So that classis that had 9,000 members in it got to send 4 pastors and 4 elders, and the one that had 500 got to send 2 pastors and 2 elders. And so in many ways, it's supposed to be sort of representative. So if you think of the sort of representative government that we have in the United States, right, we've got the House of Representatives and the Senate. And because, right, the House is weighted more toward, you get more representation, more population, right? In many ways, our church government structure worked a little bit more like the Senate in the sense that really there's a lot of really small classes that got a ton of good representation, and these really giant classes got less. So at one point, the Regional Synod of Albany, which consisted of 6 classes, had less members than Faith Church in Dyer, Indiana. So when you've got 6 classes being able to show up with 2 each of pastors and elders, and your Faith Dyer, which some of you are familiar with, and you are just one church in a classis, and it just feels like your ideas of what should be the missional focus, about what we should be doing, are not well represented. So they became more and more disgruntled. More and more churches became more and more disgruntled because anything that got decided at the national level then had to go back to the classes and had to be approved by 2/3 of them. But again, same problem. It works a little bit more like the U.S. Senate than the House of Representatives. So instead of there being checks and balances, it was all like that U.S. Senate kind of thing. And it felt to a lot of people like the tail was wagging the dog, so to speak. The sort of minor voices got to have more of a major say in many of the decisions. And so it wasn't just about human sexuality. It was about what we should be focused on in terms of mission. It was about, churches in California wanted to plant churches at a pretty rapid pace, and we're finding that a number of their new believing people had a hard time with infant baptism, and were relaxing their position on infant baptism, and that was becoming a huge problem because a lot of people who were steeped in Reformed theology and infant baptism were saying, no, you can't relax those, and you can't relax the regulations on who can become a pastor. And that's where our commissioned pastor track came from, was all these churches trying to replicate and build more pastor capacity for these churches that they were planting. And a lot of more traditional churches in the RCA were like, no, you can't just bend the rules because mission and focus. And so all that to say that the history is a little bit more complicated, but all of that was happening for 40 years between 1978 and 2018, where there was like more and more disagreement, and it felt like more and more people feeling like we're not on the same page. When we get together, we're not even on the same page. And so when I think of people like yourselves, it's like you show up at your workplace, and what if you showed up every time to your workplace, and maybe this happens for you, but you come to the you come to the coffee space or whatever it happens to be, and what if every time you got together, it's just like we're not on the same page, we're not going after the same goals, we don't agree about how to get after those goals, and that'd be a pretty annoying workplace to go to, right? So that's the way it was feeling, and Don Poost was our general secretary in 2018, who visited. And when you're general secretary, you go around and visit all the churches around the nation, and as he did so, it became really clear to him that like something needed to give. And so he created this group called the Vision for 2020 group, and the stated goal of that group was to figure out, hey, can we stay together as a denomination, and if not, what's the best way for us to peacefully separate? That was kind of the command, not the command, but the commission that was given to this group of people. Come back in 2020 with a solid plan, because we can't go on being together the way we are, and there's enough like sort of water under the bridge. It's not worth trying to fix and mend things. We should just come up with a good plan of how we should go separate directions, was part of the vibe. But the 2020 team came back, and they came back in, see, I still have my drawing in my pants. Sorry, I was at the Somerset's house on Friday night, and I got a drawing. I wore these pants. Okay. But yes, the 2020 team was supposed to come back in 2020. We didn't meet in 2020, June 2020. It got postponed all the way to October of 2021 was when that report was received. And they came back, this group of 12 people came back with this report that basically said nothing should change. So there was a paper that was accepted on human sexuality in 1978. That is still the stated position of the denomination. That shouldn't change. And it is still so that local bodies get to have the most authority. So the most authority resides in our denomination in the classis. The classis has the authority to exercise discipline, to decide matters within various churches. So even when I was called here, you couldn't fire me unless the classis agreed that you wanted to fire me. That sort of thing. The classis is supposed to help you right now. I know Nate Pyle is your supervisor, and the classis is supposed to help you when you're without a pastor, blah, blah, blah. So nothing should change. The stated positions are still the same, and it's still going to be exercised locally, because that was another one of the things that was a big issue, is that they wanted authority to change so that, if we wanted to bring a charge as classis Ileana to some other classis that seemed to be going astray, regardless of how that issue of going astray happened to be, people wanted us to be able to do that, but we weren't. All the power resides in the classis, so you couldn't bring charges across classes. And then if you wanted to change the way that worked, it had to be approved by 2/3 of the classes, which 2/3 of them were not going to approve of. So the structure was never going to change, and they didn't like the structure. So people who were ready to go were hoping this Vision 2020 team would come back with this sort of like, hey, here's how we can do this differently, here's how we could, but nothing should change, and people who want to leave can leave. So one of the options was this generous separation. So a 5-year block from 2021 to 2026 where nobody was going to come and say, hey, we want your property. If you're leaving, you can't leave, Nobody was going to come and say, you can't leave with your property. So this generous separation, but generous from the standpoint of the church too, like you're going to pay your dues for 1 year after you say you're going to leave. So don't you just leave and not be mindful of all the financial obligations that exist within the RCA. So mutual generosity, but mostly this sense of, hey, the measures we used to use when churches left were, hey, we could still keep the property as the denomination. And hey, we can also, the classis could also say, this is being railroaded by your pastor and 2 elders. The whole church doesn't want to leave. We're going to stop you from leaving. And that's not the case right now. During this 5-year window, the classis really can't say anything. As long as 75% of the people in the church agree we need to move to this other place, the church can go, and the classis can't stop it for any reason and can't keep its property or anything like that. So these are these rules that are in place based on this report. So, since the report said nothing should change and so many people wanted something to change, people have been leaving, right? So if you're not aware, 25% of the churches have already left from the RCA, and they are usually larger churches, so that represents almost 50% of the membership have left too. So to go back to Faith Dyer, right, if you're unfamiliar with, there's some churches in the Upper Indiana, Chicagoland area. They used to be part of Ileana Classis. They separated years ago because they were frustrated with Ileana Classis, and our churches like this church not planting churches rapidly enough. So they created a new classis called New Thing Classis. It included Faith Dyer and Cornerstone in Bourbonnais and Living Springs in Chicago Heights and Calvary in Orland Park and one other church. So 5 rather large churches that created this thing called New Thing Classis, and shortly before this report even came out, that whole classis left together. So all 5 churches just left. And since they left as a classis and all the authority resides in the classis, nobody was going to argue with them at that time. Like, who's going to argue with you? It would have required the regional synod to file a lawsuit against them. Didn't happen. So all 5 of those churches left and became something called the Kingdom Network, and a whole bunch of other churches have left. Point being, they're mostly larger churches. To have 25% leave and almost 50% of the actual membership of the denomination has left. And what was I going to say about that? Oh, so that has really practical implications. So this is what it has meant for us up in northern Michigan. So we're at Traverse City at Faith Reformed Church. We're part of the northern Michigan classis. It had 13 churches, now 9, one of which switched classes. So that's another thing that's happening right now. People are switching into different groups. And 3 of them left the RCA. So pretty typical even in our classes. Our classes reflects that wider thing. So, right, so like 25% of the churches kind of shifting, and they were some of the larger churches in our classes. So we haven't lost exactly 50% of the membership in our classes, but we've lost a big chunk in our classes alone. In the Regional Synod of the Great Lakes, which is not what you're a part of. So this is mostly Michigan churches, almost entirely Michigan churches. There were 7 classes, so those are the 7 classes that are listed up there. But there were 186 churches. For what I understand, there's 46 churches that have now left. This accounts for 45 of them. But so 3 churches within our classis in northern Michigan, 8 churches in Muskegon, 4 churches in North Grand Rapids classis, 1 in Holland classis, 3 in, that should say GLCC, not GRCC, Great Lakes City classis, which is around Grand Rapids, but also incorporates Ann Arbor and Toledo and Cleveland. So 3 churches from that classis, 15 from Zeeland classis out of 20 churches, and 11 out of Southwest Michigan classis. So it has had real practical implications because, again, this is about 25% of the churches have left the Regional Synod of the Great Lakes, and a large number of the larger churches have left the RCA. So the RCA as we knew it, like when I first moved to West Michigan, I'd never heard of the Reformed Church in America, never heard of the Christian Reformed Church in America, but when I moved up here, I'm like, man, there's a Reformed Church on every block. and it was felt like the RCA and CRC like owned West Michigan. It was Jerusalem for a reason, but now that has changed. Not that these churches are no longer Reformed, so to speak, but they're no longer part of the Reformed Church in America, and it's a whole new thing. And in particular, Muskegon, Zeeland, and Southwest Michigan classes are all now in a position where something has to change, or the classes itself is going to become dysfunctional. So it has real practical implications that these churches are leaving because the classes themselves are becoming dysfunctional. So we went from having 46, we're down already to 42 classes, I think, now, because all of the Dakotas classes left together too, which included like 32 churches in South and North Dakota. They all left. So we're shrinking in terms of classes, and as a regional synod of Great Lakes, we're trying to figure out how we're going to realign and what that means. So it's had real practical implications. Where have most of these churches gone? Most of them have gone to either the Alliance of Reformed Churches, which was started out of Zeeland, which is part of the reason that 15 churches have left out of Zeeland classes. Most of them have gone to that. And then a number to the Kingdom Network. Like I said, that was those 5 churches in that Chicagoland. They started the Kingdom Network. They didn't necessarily think they'd expand. Now they have like 30 churches, some of which are in California. Of those 11 churches that left from the Southwest Michigan area in Kalamazoo, 6 of them left from Kalamazoo area to go to the Kingdom Network. A vast majority have gone to the Alliance of Reformed Churches. They have 153 churches now that are part of the Alliance. And I think 23 more are in the application process to come on board, so you can hear a lot of them have gone there. There's another thing called the Sending Network, a few random ones. There's a church in Grand Rapids that had a Wesleyan interim pastor and have gone Wesleyan. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, you can ask questions whenever you want. Yeah, so Gary's asking if all the ones that have joined the Alliance, are they former RCA churches? As of right now, yes, from what I know of, they are, although there's some inquiries from other groups, because the whole denominational world is kind of being churned up and blended and turned inside out, and so there are other churches from other places applying that want to be part of the Alliance of Reformed Churches too. Yep. But the vast majority have gone to these 2, but there's some other ones out there, like I said, Sending Network, a few random ones that have gone to some other denominations that are out there. But this has reshaped a lot of things. So what does that mean for where the RCA is currently at? It means 5 of the 8 regional synods. So there's regional synods, Regional Synod of the Great Lakes. You're in the regional synods of Mid-America in this area. There's a regional synod of the Heartlands, regional synod of the Far West, regional synod of Canada. There's 3 that are out in the east, that way. The 3 in the east have only lost like 3 total churches. Those churches have been content to stick around in the RCA. So that part of the fabric of the RCA hasn't changed. Meanwhile, the Synod of the Far West is about to close its doors because almost every church in California and Washington has left the RCA. So that has changed the sort of map of the RCA in a pretty defined way. This next statistic was published by, if you look on the RCA site, if you just search for State of the Church of the RCA, there's a whole fresh web page that Eddie Alamon and some others, Eddie Alamon's our current general secretary, have composed. But they say 76% of the churches that are left are 100 or fewer. So that's part of it. There's been a whole first wave of churches that have left. This is, again, just my perspective. Some people would say, oh, there's not going to be like a giant second wave, but I think there will be a second wave because some churches are just catching up to this conversation. Some churches were trying to figure out, hey, let's see what happens in the RCA. Maybe we do want to stick around. A number of them are still that way, or churches like ourselves in Faith in Traverse City. We didn't want to be too like reactionary and just jump when, and at the same time, we're seeing what's developing and what's outside of the RCA, and the grass doesn't always look that green on the other side. But there is a second wave coming of people who have their foot, like 1 foot out the door of the RCA. And so there's this denominational thing. So again, I'm not trying to like um, yeah, I think that people who are most interested in hearing some of this are leaders who need to make decisions, but I don't want other people to just like draw too many conclusions and whatever. I can answer some questions here in a moment. So there's a first wave, second wave. The other things, these last two pieces I just want to mention because these are some of the things that are reasons why people are holding on to the RCA. One is global missions, because we've got really strong global missions around the world. We're pretty well known as the RCA, this tiny little denomination, for having great global missions, and it's all coming unraveling because the people who work at the center of global missions are paid by our denominational shares, and less churches around to pay those shares. That's less money to actually employ those people, and so that's going to change soon. And yet you can still leave and sponsor missionaries who are part of the RCA. It's just you're not supporting the people at the center of that system. So people like, most of you would know J.P. Sundararajan. J.P. is the current director of global missions. His salary is paid by our member shares. So you got less members, you got less capacity to pay people like J.P. And these new things that are being created don't have an office of global missions. They encourage churches to participate in global missions, but it's not like it's going through a system like the RCA. It's like support that Wycliffe missionary, support that missionary, that sort of thing. So people still loving global missions, and there's this strange thing happening of this influx of Hispanic churches, partially attracted by Eddie Alaman, who's our current general secretary. And yeah, so even though we've lost a number of churches, in the classes of de las Naciones, forgive the Spanish hack job there, but there's a classes out there that has almost entirely Hispanic churches, and they welcomed 37 Hispanic churches just a couple years ago. And the classes of the Central Plains just welcomed like 24 Hispanic churches. So we're losing all sorts of churches, but welcoming all these Hispanic churches. And so it might not be much of a Dutch denomination in the future if it continues on its present path. It will have this multicultural future, which is great, especially for those who have zero Dutch and aren't tied to it anyway. Yeah, so there's this weird thing happening, and as is reported on that State of the Church document that you could find these other statistics on, there are over 400 churches around Latin America and South America who are interested in joining our denomination, which is this very strange thing to me. But so could we become a global denomination that is multicultural and has all these Hispanic churches that want to be reformed? And if so, how does that change this sort of the map that I'm trying to draw for you, just to give you an update of what's going on? So there's some interesting things happening in the RCA, some of which are disconcerting and feel like, oh man, the ship is sinking. And then there's other things that like, oh, God's up to something in these other ways. And trying to discern your way through that, I think, is part of the job as a church, to find your way through it. Yeah, Deb. Mm. Mm. Right. So Deb's asking if they were Hispanic churches who just desired to join the RCA, or RCA churches that became Hispanic as their neighborhoods changed or something like that. Yeah, I think it's more the former, less of the latter. I don't think there's a ton of churches like that started a Hispanic, side service over here that all of a sudden that became the main thing and that church joined. There are a few of those, but largely these are Hispanic church plants and Hispanic, yeah, and in regions of the country where there's a lot more of a Hispanic population, there's a big boom, and actually the Reformed Church can be attractive to some of them who are former Catholics, because the Reformed Church still baptizes infants, and there's like they feel a home there. There's a tradition there. So yeah, So that's where some of them are coming from. So all that to say that, again, this is just my perspective. As we have looked at it as a congregation, we have a special little team that's looking at it, myself and 2 current elders and 2 former elders, and we're just sort of researching, okay, what else is out there that, and why would we be motivated to move? Has something changed in the RCA? Is there something over there that we feel like we could contribute to, that we could be a part of, and that they could contribute back to us, and it could be a mutually encouraging kind of situation? Should we be a part of that sort of thing? So we have considered, hey, what's going on in this new thing called the Alliance of Reformed Churches? This is a group of people, that were discontent with the RCA for a long time. As much as there wasn't like a clear split of what's happening in the RCA, this is about as clear, out of all the splinters, this is the biggest that has developed. And so some of it would feel very familiar. It includes a lot of the churches from the RCA, like we talked about, and they've made some decisions that have been in response to some of the dysfunction within the RCA, which you may or may not be comfortable with. But one of the things that they've developed is, instead of classes, they're going to have networks, and those networks are driven by some level of similarity and camaraderie. So they have created something called the Harvest Network. So think of it like a classis, like a group of churches. It's the Harvest Network, and they named it Harvest for the dual reason of, hey, we're interested in seeing the Lord of the harvest do his work, but also because they tend to be churches that are outside of city centers, in smaller towns, churches like Heartland Community Church. And so it includes a number of rural churches. I think that, it's not a terrible option for a place like Heartland to consider if you're considering, hey, we don't want to be part of the RCA anymore. Joining the Alliance of Reformed Churches, and then you can join any network you want. So you could join some network that's out in California, but this Harvest Network is based out of Michigan and includes a bunch of rural churches. So that's an option. So like I said, a bunch of churches have jumped to the Kingdom Network. We did our due diligence to talk to people from the Kingdom Network, and it includes about 30 churches. This network just wants to be lean, and they have very minimal rules. The Alliance, if you want to become ordained in the Alliance, they've got real good, decent structure in place, and it's going to be this national ordination process, national body that oversees the ordination process, and you got to do all these things, and every 5 years you have to check back in with goals, and if you haven't met those goals, they could revoke your ordination, that sort of thing. So they're serious about making sure their pastors keep learning, because right now, Andrew and I got ordained, and nobody comes back and says, hey, are you still growing in your faith? Are you falling more in love with Jesus? Nobody asks us about that. It just happens. We just are going about our business, and you just trust. But in the Alliance, they're going to check every 5 years. Kingdom Network is total opposite. It's like, if your local church sees somebody they want to ordain, boom, do it. They're ordained. And it's pretty loosey-goosey. I think that runs into a ton of problems. And everything exists at the local network, and there is no national body. There's just a national board of 8 to 10 people who get to make decisions, including whether or not they throw you out of the denomination. So it's a whole new world out there in post-RCA world. We looked at the Christian Reformed Church, too. We've been talking with people from the Christian Reformed Church because, hey, we've been kissing cousins. They've even been kissing married people. So why not join the CRC? Well, the CRC, man, that's a hornet's nest right now, too. If you haven't watched what's been happening in the CRC, their synod last year, they accepted a human sexuality report, and it was approved. And they did one other thing, too, but they basically came down, hey, we're going to affirm a traditional view of sexuality, and now there's all these consequences of like, hey, well, how much are we going to enact that and discipline people who don't participate in it, or what's the process going to be for people to leave the CRC who want to leave the CRC? And so they have like 1 million overtures to their General Synod this year, and there's a lot that's kind of up in the air in the CRC. But this is another place that we're looking at. ECO. This is a group that separated from the PCUSA like a decade ago. You might have heard of people like John Ortberg. He was a pastor in the Presbyterian Church that helped lead ECO. It's about 415, I think, churches that are Presbyterian in nature. But the big thing about them is if you go to their website, 3 words that they're identifying as: Reformed, Evangelical, Egalitarian. So Reformed, Evangelical, and Egalitarian. So if you don't understand all that, right, they're Reformed. All Presbyterians are part of the Reformed tradition. I know, it's 11:30. That's good that you have that alarm on there. It's probably for like taking your med. So Reformed, and then Evangelical, believing in the particularity of the gospel and the good news of the gospel, and then Egalitarian, which is a way of saying, hey, we affirm women in office, women as elders and women as pastors. One of the things that's happened in both the Kingdom Network and the Alliance of Reformed Churches is that they've stepped back into what is essentially the conscience clause. So if you've been a part of the RCA for a while, when women were first ordained, there was a conscience clause that said, if your conscience doesn't permit you to participate in things like Andrea's ordination, you don't have to go and participate in something you don't want to, kind of thing. So your conscience could say, I don't affirm women in ministry, but I'll let her become a woman in ministry. I just won't be a part of those processes. That was removed a couple years from the RCA and has been put back into the Alliance. So there are Alliance churches and Kingdom Network churches that do not affirm women in ministry or women as elders. ECO is egalitarian from the get-go, meaning they affirm women in offices. And so it's another option we've been looking at. I'm just giving you our perspective. Those are just options. Like I said, none of them it's just like, man, the grass is really green over there. We're running over there. It's not like that at all. So that was all I prepared from this slide standpoint. I just wanted to give you my perspective and see if that helped in your sort of education about what's happening in the RCA. What does it mean for us? What is the possible future for us? I don't know. I hope it gives you some context. And I know we're supposed to go eat here soon, but I wanted to see, what questions do you have? Yeah, John. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so John asked, there was some conversation about a standalone mission organization. Well, that was one of the recommendations that came from that Vision 2020 group. Like, nothing should change about our theology or our structure, but given that a bunch of churches aren't going to be content with this decision, and it might affect our global missions, we should separate our global missions and have it become its own 501c3 so that it can survive even if the denomination doesn't. It was essentially what it was. And that did not get approved. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but there were some implications about that people thought were not good, and so it didn't get approved to separate it out from the RCA. And so it's still a part of the RCA. Yeah. Yeah, Gary. Mm. Yeah, I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but there was at one point the possibility that, hey, as a prelude to a split, we would create 2 general synods, but I think that's all in the past now. So there will just be one general synod. And yes, unless the structure changes, which would require getting something approved at general synod and having it approved by all the classes, the power will still reside at the classis level. Yep. So we'll reside with the other churches that are here in Indiana and maybe in Illinois that are a part of the Indiana classis. Yeah. That made me think of something. I can't remember. Age. Exactly. Yeah. Other questions you might have. Was some of that just repeat? You already knew it? Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah, so John's asking a follow-up question about the way the demographic has changed in the RCA, and yeah, what does that really look like, and what might it look like in the future? Yeah, that's part of why I put up those slides about this slide describing a little bit of the way that the map has changed in the RCA. I do think it's significant when you consider that 3 of those regional synods in the East tend to be regional synods that we would consider to be pretty progressive in nature. It's not just about sexuality, it's about all sorts of things related to church life and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so that's changed, and yeah, there's been, part of the reason I put up that second statistic is that, of course, there's something really stinking beautiful about a church like Heartland Community Church that's, worshiping fewer than 100. Right? That's why you're here, because there's still something really beautiful about it. And part of what is also so is that there are some tremendous leaders at these bigger churches. There's been this leadership suck, sort of, right? You can hear the vacuum sort of sucking it right out of the RCA. So that's been a demographic change that I'm concerned about. There's a little bit of a leadership thing that's happening. And then, yeah, how's the demographic going to change? There is a second wave coming. There's churches that were just busy like hiring another pastor, or churches that have been on the outskirts of the RCA and not thinking about it, or whatever. There's this second wave coming of people leaving, and that's going to change the demographic. But the biggest demographic change is that now that all those churches that left would be considered conservative traditional churches. So you've got lot less of that sort of voting block or that group of people in the RCA. So the quote unquote balance of power has kind of changed in a pretty substantial way, and that's why it's interesting to think what happens when the Hispanic churches come in, because they tend to be very conservative theologically, and so where do they fit and how do they fit? But conservative theologically, but also thinking big time along the lines of immigration and what it means to be multicultural and not just like America-centric and all that kind of stuff. So they bring some different dynamics that aren't dynamics the RCA has currently thought about. So yeah, as far as what's upcoming, I think there's this second wave coming. I think we have yet to see the true implications of this new map, which is part of the reason churches like ourselves just want to see what happens at this upcoming General Synod. And since there's this big 5-year window, there's no giant rush to get out. Nobody's coming for your property. Nobody's coming for this building. Everything's okay. And so, so there's still time to see how will these things unfold. Yeah. Dan. So Dan asked, what is the major in my mind, what's the major reason people are leaving? And then are there, is it some of it just follow the leader? To answer the second question, for sure, some of it's follow the leader. When you have a whole classes, like the Dakota classes, just leave together, some of those churches are just like, okay, we're doing what they're doing down the street. And they've got a couple good leaders or whatever, and we're just going to follow them. As far as reasons why, that's why I tried to explain that complicated history, because some of it's about, hey, we want this sexuality thing resolved. We're adhering to what Christians have believed the first 2,000 years of Christianity, and we're sticking to that. We're staying on that. And so they want that kind of resolved, and in the new system, it's kind of resolved. But they're also taking care of those other things. So you heard it in the way I described the Kingdom Network. There's no longer this large assembly that has no power. There's this national board that can make decisions every month. So another part of the problem was you go to General Synod, and you think you made a decision. Well, it has to be approved by 2/3 of the classes, which takes a full year. So that even if you get it approved, the amount of time it takes In these new denominations, they make decisions every month that are just happening. And so if we want to do something different, it's different the next month. It's not you have to wait a year and a half to 2 years to see it go through the bureaucratic process or create a team. I think that's the thing I was going to say that I forgot, Gary, or maybe it was related to John's question. There's a restructuring team out there right now that's going to come forward with new recommendations on how the RCA would be restructured. So not just 2 synods, but what is the better way to do this in terms of our structure and the way that authority works and the way that accountability works. But that's a huge issue for people. The way the structure worked, the way the accountability worked, the lack of missional focus on the things they wanted to be focused on. Now that they're in their new thing, Kingdom Network, their byline is we're multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches. And that's really what they're about. They really don't care about global mission very much. I mean, they kind of do. They've got, they mostly care about planting churches globally because they're all about planting churches in the Kingdom Network. So you really don't want to be part of their new network unless you really like planting churches. But that was kind of reactionary to the RCA. They thought the RCA did not plant churches fast enough. And so that's part of the reason they left. It wasn't just about some theological issue so much as it was, we're planting churches, and if you're not coming with us, forget you. We're out of here. And that's why they left, even Kingdom Network left before we even had the Vision 2020 report. So it's not, that's why I say a complicated history on that first slide, because it's not just one issue, it's all these other things that add up. And that's why people are leaving. And that's why the grass doesn't always look green on the other side. At our church, we're not like rah-rah, gung-ho church planters. So Kingdom Network already doesn't feel like a great fit. And we do like the accountability of, pastors who get ordained. And we do like women in ministry, and they kind of don't. So it's like, I don't think we're going to join that group. So even though there's 30 RCA churches that have joined that group. Our church is definitely thinking about leaving the RCA. We're content right now that, like, hey, as of right now, most of what has changed is that a bunch of people have left, but the RCA is still the RCA. It's got this heritage. That's another thing that gets lost in it. This tie to the Reformed tradition is all of a sudden, like, severed, and the tie to the colleges that, we've got a ton of people in our church that went to Calvin or Hope. And the tie to things like Western Seminary, all those things are cut in these new things. So there's reason to sort of stick around. But yeah, the lay people on my team, I would say two in particular are like, man, we should go. Why are we still here? Yeah. So yeah, I think that's some of the things you gotta wrestle with. I think it helps to go ahead and say, hey, yeah, what are the things that are most important to us? That's one of the things we've been working on as a church, is to say, let's say these things that are most important. So we just finished a whole winter series that was about what we're most deeply rooted in, that includes the Reformed tradition. So we're rooted in Christ, rooted in the Word of God, rooted in grace. Well, those are all things that are part of what the Reformed tradition's about. Sola Scripturis, Solus Christus, all this stuff. And we had a family class that Andrea and our associate pastor helped lead that was for families and children, that was about those 5 solas. And I led a Reformed tradition class and had a bunch of people that were, some of whom were steeped in the Reformed tradition, had to memorize the Heidelberg Catechism growing up. Some of which had no clue. They came in later and didn't have any didn't understand the Reformed tradition. So to get kind of educated in that, because we're only looking at options that are Reformed, whether it's staying in the RCA or leaving, we're still going to be a part of that. But it's a way of saying, hey, these are the things that we're about. And what else are we about? Well, in our setting, we're about discipleship and spiritual formation. We're about growing more leaders in the next generation. We're about local and global mission. So we want to join a group of people that's about that. If we were all about church planting, we'd probably already be in the Kingdom Network, but we're not. Not that church planting is bad. But I think that's one of the things each of the churches has to do, like weigh out, okay, yeah, are we really rooted in the Reformed tradition? If so, what does that mean? And what are the things that we're most deeply passionate about? And is the RCA still passionate about that? I think I should wrap, yeah. Yeah. So in the RCA, Gary's asking, hey, if a church decided to leave, what is the end date on when you can be a part of that? The window that was approved at General Synod is this 5-year window, so it goes to October 2026. So if you filed a petition to withdraw before then, you should, in theory, come under those rules. But again, the authority rests at the classis level. So our classis approved, even before General Synod did, our classis said, hey, during this time, if you want to leave, we're going to approve a generous separation. We're not coming after your property. So even if this General Synod changed its rules, our classis would still be generous toward everybody. I don't know about Ileana classis. But if you do leave, yeah, you're supposed to go through this process where you get at least 75% of your consistory to approve it. You file the petition, and you have to have 75% of your congregation approve it. And as long as that's in place, it just sort of kicks in motion this process. And from 1 year after you filed the petition, you're supposed to pay your assessments. And so for 1 calendar year after filing the petition. So there's this whole process that's out there. Yeah. Yeah. John wants me to wrap up.
I saw it coming, so I just wanted to take a minute to thank you, Drew, and I appreciate you coming back. Really easy to distill this conversation down to a single issue, and I think very much so it's been touted as a single issue, and nothing's more exciting than talking about governance and rules of order and how many thirds get to make decisions, and who we're associated with. And so it's a in-depth and deep conversation that we all need to have. And by all means, when there are questions, come see one of the elders. Ron and I are here. Florida's going to warm up too much here a little bit, so we'll have more elders shortly.
I want to say one thing. Yeah. Just as a follow-up to his, I appreciate you coming and saying it's really easy to focus on the negative things. That's one of the things that we're trying to do is, hey, what do we want to really be about? What's the vision we're headed toward? Hey, we're planted in the Reformed tradition. We want to be with a group of churches that are serious about discipleship and spiritual formation. We want to be with a group of churches that are about local global mission, and it becomes an opportunity instead of just a drag.
So again, I want to thank you. This conversation's ongoing. We want to have it with each and every one of you as we're having this, and it's super important to where we are today and where we're going to be in the future. Whether that is with the RCA, with what that looks like in the past, or what it might look like in the future, or with another denomination altogether. But again, we are very much on the early stages of this conversation, and we very, very much appreciate Drew coming out and sharing some of his perspective and insight. So. Drew, I don't know if you want to close this in prayer. We always enjoy them. So.
Lord, we look for your guidance. We look for your guidance. When I think about this conversation, what it means for Faith Reformed in Traverse City or Heartland Community Church, we look for your guidance. We pray, Holy Spirit, your guidance over this group of people in how they not only discern their way into the future, but how they have the conversation in the meantime. And Lord, speaking of conversation, we ask your blessing over this remainder of this conversation as now we now turn to food. We pray that it would be a blessing over our bodies and that you would be honored and glorified by the nature of our fellowship. And all your people say,